The first thing they told Elias Hunter about Ruth Wells was that 3 men had already tried to court her, and all 3 had ridden out of Caldwell, Kansas, looking considerably smaller than when they had ridden in. Elias heard this while seated at the bar of the Dusty Spur Saloon on a Tuesday evening in the spring of 1882, nursing a glass of rye whiskey and minding his own considerable business. The man doing the telling was Harlan Boggs, a cattle broker with a red face and an opinion on everything, and he leaned across the bar counter like he was sharing something precious. "That Wells woman," Harlan said, swirling his own drink with the authority of a man who believed himself fascinating. She turned down the Peterson boy, told him flat out his conversation bored her to tears. Then there was McCready, the hardware fellow from Wichita. She disagreed with him in front of the whole congregation at Sunday service. Something about the water rights on the South Creek made him look like a fool, apparently. And Donovan, you remember Donovan. Elias did not remember Donovan because Elias had only arrived in Caldwell 3 days ago. He said nothing and let Harlan continue. Donovan tried to put a fence around her property while she was in town buying flour. Said he was doing her a favor, keeping the cattle off her garden. She dismantled the whole thing herself before sundown and stacked every post neatly in front of his door with a note that said she would handle her own property. "Thank you kindly." "She is," Harlan concluded with great satisfaction, "completely ungovernable." Elias Hunter set his glass down with a quiet click. He was 31 years old, lean and brown from years of working under open skies, with dark eyes that had a tendency to find the calm center of any situation. He had come to Caldwell because he had heard there was work to be had, specifically the kind of work that involved surveying land boundaries for the new homestead claims flooding into southern Kansas. He was good at it. He liked straight lines and honest measurements and land that did not lie about what it was. He was not, as he had made clear to no one because it had not come up, looking to govern anyone. "She sounds like she has good sense," Elias said, and finished his whiskey. Harlan looked at him like he had spoken in a foreign language. Elias left the saloon and walked back toward the modest room he was renting above the feed store, and he thought about fences that were put up without asking permission, and he thought about a woman who dismantled them before sundown, and he thought that the men of Caldwell, Kansas, seemed to have a peculiar idea about what courtship was supposed to accomplish. He met Ruth Wells the following morning. He was walking along the main street with his leather satchel of survey instruments over one shoulder, looking for the land office where he was supposed to meet the county clerk about a new property dispute near the southern edge of town. He had his compass in his hand, not because he needed it on the main street of a town laid out in perfectly comprehensible straight lines, but because he liked the weight of it. It was one of his habits. He found things to hold onto when his mind was working. Ruth Wells was standing outside the land office. She was not standing the way women in 1882 often stood outside of official buildings, with the patient, slightly apologetic posture of someone who had arrived in a place not entirely meant for them. She was standing like she owned the doorframe, one hand braced against it, her dark brown hair pinned back but threatening to escape on the left side, where a strand had worked its way loose and was blowing in the warm spring wind. She had a sheaf of papers tucked under one arm and an expression on her face that was somewhere between determination and exasperation. She was arguing with the door. Or rather, she was arguing through the door, which had been shut in a way that suggested it had been shut deliberately, with someone on the other side of it who knew she was there. "Mr. Aldrich," she was saying, with the measured patience of someone who had been patient for longer than patience deserved. "The survey record you have filed for the Clement land shows the eastern boundary at the wrong creek marker. I have the original deed right here. I have had the original deed right here for 45 minutes. I am not leaving until someone in your office looks at it." There was a muffled sound from inside that sounded noncommittal. "I understand you are busy," Ruth said. the word busy carrying a very specific weight that suggested she did not entirely believe it. But this boundary error affects my water access, and the spring planting has already begun, and I need this corrected before the end of the week. Elias stopped. He did not mean to stop in a way that was conspicuous, but stopping was what his body did, because the situation was directly related to his work, and also because he was, by nature, someone who paid attention to things. Ruth turned and looked at him. Her eyes were a warm, dark hazel, and they looked at him with the direct, assessing quality of someone who had learned not to waste time determining whether a person was worth speaking to honestly. "Are you the surveyor?" she asked. "I am," he said. "Elias Hunter. Ruth Wells." She did not offer her hand in the way that was considered formally appropriate for 1882, but she looked at him with something that was almost a handshake in and of itself, a direct, sizing-up kind of look that took his measure without apology. "Are you going in there?" "That was my plan." "Good." She handed him the papers from under her arm. "Because the boundary on the Clement deed is wrong, and whoever filed the current survey record either cannot read a creek marker correctly or was paid not to. I cannot tell you which yet, but I intend to find out." Elias took the papers. He looked at them. He looked at them for perhaps 15 seconds more than was strictly polite, because what he was reading was interesting. She was right. The creek marker noted in the county record was unambiguously the wrong one. It was either a genuine error or it was not, and either way it had the effect of placing Ruth Wells's water access on the wrong side of a legal line. "You are correct," he said. Ruth looked at him. "The marker in the county record is the Southern Fork Junction," he said, "but the original deed notation describes a rock outcropping on the eastern bank, which is approximately 40 yards north of the junction. Different marker, different boundary. You lose about 3 acres of creek access if the county record stands." Ruth stared at him for a moment. Not a long moment, but the kind where you can see someone recalibrating slightly. "Yes," she said, "exactly that. Let me go inside." He went inside. Harlan had not mentioned what the land office clerk looked like, but Elias had formed a general impression from the muffled noncommittal sounds, and the actual Mr. Aldrich, a round, defensive man in a wool vest, confirmed it. He had the look of someone who had made a decision he did not want to examine too closely. Elias did not accuse anyone of anything. He laid the original deed and the county record side by side on the counter and pointed to the 2 different markers with the quiet, factual precision of a man who measured things for a living. He explained the discrepancy. He said the record would need to be corrected. He said he would be returning in his official capacity to conduct a proper boundary survey and that the corrected measurements would be filed with the county. Mr. Aldrich looked at the papers. He looked at Elias. He looked at the door, which was still slightly open, and at the shadow of Ruth Wells visible through the gap. "I will look into it," he said, in the voice of a man who had just realized that looking into it was genuinely his only available option. Elias came back outside. Ruth was leaning against the post of the boardwalk overhang, her arms crossed, watching the street. She turned when she heard the door. "Well," she said. "He will look into it," Elias said. "I will be back on Thursday to conduct the formal survey. Bring the deed when I come out to your property. I want to walk the creek line and mark the correct points before I file anything with the county. That way the record is accurate and there is nothing to dispute later." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Most people tell me to let it go," she said. "They say it is a minor boundary. They say I am making a fuss." 3 acres of creek access is not minor," Elias said. "Not in a dry spring. And you had the right documentation. You were not making a fuss. You were doing exactly what needed doing." Ruth looked at him again with that direct, measuring look. Something in it was slightly different this time, not so much taking his measure as finding it better than expected. "Thursday," she said. "I will have the deed ready." She walked away down the boardwalk, and Elias watched her go. Not in the way that Harlan Boggs would have watched her go. Not with the calculating assessment of a man, deciding whether a woman was worth the trouble she was said to be. He watched her the way he watched good land, with a kind of quiet appreciation for something that knew exactly what it was. He had been in Caldwell for 4 days, and already this was the most interesting thing that had happened. Thursday came with high white clouds and a wind from the southwest that smelled like rain that was still a day or two away. Elias rode out to the Wells property in the early morning, his survey equipment in the pack behind his saddle. He had a black horse named Cooper who had strong opinions about gopher holes and no opinions about anything else, and they made good time along the creek road that wound southeast of town. The Wells property was 160 acres of homestead claim, filed 3 years ago under the Homestead Act. The house was a modest but well-built frame structure, painted a faded white that was doing its best, with a garden that was clearly someone's serious project along the south side. There were 2 horses in the small paddock, a kitchen garden with spring onions already up, and a barn that looked solid if plain. Ruth was in the garden when he arrived, doing something with a hoe that looked purposeful. She straightened when she heard Cooper's hooves and walked to the gate without the performance of pretending she had not heard him coming. "You are on time," she said. "I try to be," he said, swinging down. "My father used to say punctuality was the simplest form of respect," she said. "Your father sounds like a sensible man." He was. There was something brief and closed in the way she said it, not cold, just finished. He did not press. She had the deed ready, as she had said she would. She had also, he discovered when she spread it on the garden fence post, marked the creek sections in pencil with neat, careful annotations noting where the language of the deed corresponded to physical landmarks. It was, frankly, better preparation than most of the landowners he worked with managed, most of whom handed him a paper and shrugged. "You have done this before," he said. "I have been dealing with property documents since I was 15, she said. "My father was ill for several years before he died. The property was in both our names, then just mine. I learned how to read a deed the same way I learned to read a land map, because if I did not, someone else would read it for me and tell me what it said." Elias nodded. He understood that particular education, the kind that comes from necessity and proves itself durable. They walked the creek line together. This was the main work of the morning, moving along the eastern bank of the small tributary that formed the boundary between the Wells claim and the Clement land to the east, which had recently changed hands and whose new owner, a man named Grover Tilden, had been the one whose filing had produced the incorrect boundary record. Elias took measurements. He drove marker stakes. He noted the rock outcropping that the original deed described, which was right where Ruth had said it would be, and it was unambiguously north of the Creek Fork junction that the county record had used. Ruth walked with him, not in the way of someone who felt obligated to hover, but in the way of someone who was genuinely interested in the process. She asked questions. Good questions, the kind that showed she had been thinking about the land and not just the paperwork. She asked about how survey measurements were established, about the differences between monuments and markers, about what happened when natural features like creek banks shifted over time. Elias answered her. He liked answering genuine questions. He liked that she asked about things and then actually listened to the answers. At some point around mid-morning, when they had been walking along the bank for perhaps 2 hours and had reached the northern end of the disputed line, Ruth stopped and looked out across the creek at the cottonwood trees on the far bank, which were just putting out their first small leaves, pale and bright against the dark bark. "I know people think I am difficult," she said. She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity or particular complaint, the way you might note that the ground was clay-heavy in the lower field. Elias drove a final stake into the bank and straightened. "I heard something to that effect," he said. "What did you hear?" "Harlan Boggs told me you were ungovernable." Ruth made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Harlan Boggs put a lid on his wife's opinion 15 years ago and has been wondering why she looks unhappy ever since." Elias looked at her. He could not help it. There was something so precisely accurate about what she had just said that it deserved acknowledgement. "He is not entirely wrong about ungovernable," Ruth continued. tucking a strand of escaped hair back behind her ear. "I just think ungovernable means different things to different people. To Harlan Boggs, it means I do not do what men tell me to do without asking why. To me, it means I have my own mind and I use it. I cannot figure out why one of those is supposed to be a problem." "It is not," Elias said. She looked at him again with that measuring quality. "You keep saying that," she said, "things that the rest of the town would argue with." "I keep meaning them," he said simply. They walked back toward the house. The wind was picking up from the southwest now, and the distant smell of rain had gotten closer. There were chores Ruth needed to see to before the weather came in, and Elias needed to get his measurements organized while the light was still good. They parted at the garden gate with an arrangement to meet at the land office on Friday afternoon when Elias would file the corrected survey record. It seemed like a professional arrangement. It probably was, at that point, still mostly a professional arrangement. But Elias Hunter thought about the cottonwood trees going pale and bright on the far bank while she was talking about her own mind. And he thought about it on the ride back to town. And he thought about it while he ate his supper that evening at the boarding house. And he was honest enough with himself to admit that professional arrangements did not usually follow a man home in quite that particular way. Friday came and the corrected record was filed. Mr. Aldrich managed this with the expression of a man performing a task he had been maneuvered into and could not see his way out of, which was accurate enough. Elias signed his survey documents. Ruth filed her deed annotation. The boundary was corrected in the official record, giving her back the 3 acres of creek access that should have been hers all along. Outside the land office, she turned to him on the boardwalk and said, "Thank you, Mr. Hunter." "Elias," he said. "Thank you, Elias." She seemed to be deciding something. "I have a pot of coffee and a very good apple pie. If you have not eaten, you are welcome to come out and eat with me." This was not, he was fairly certain, the kind of invitation she extended regularly. She said it simply, as she said everything, without coyness or calculated hesitation, but there was something in the directness of it that told him it was genuine rather than social reflex. "I would like that," he said. He would like that was perhaps the most significant understatement of Elias Hunter's considered and understatement-prone life, but it seemed like the right thing to say. They rode out to her property in the late afternoon light. The boundary question was settled, the paperwork was filed, and neither of them seemed to feel the need to discuss it anymore. They talked instead, which was different from going through the motions of talking. Ruth talked about her garden and the spring planting, and which parts of the south field she was thinking of converting from fallow to winter wheat. Elias talked about the survey work he had coming, a large claim dispute north of town that was going to take the better part of 3 weeks and involved neighbors who were not speaking to each other. "Can you fix that?" she asked. "When neighbors will not speak?" "I can fix the boundary," he said. "The speaking is up to them." "Do they usually come around?" He thought about it. "Mostly. When the line is clear, people stop fighting over where it is. The argument was never really about the land. It was about not knowing." Ruth was quiet for a moment, and he glanced sideways at her in the late light. She was riding a good sturdy bay mare with an easy hand and sitting straight without the rigid correctness of someone performing horsemanship. "That is interesting," she said. "I think you are right about that." At the house, she made coffee with the straightforward efficiency of someone for whom coffee was a serious matter and not a performance, and she cut slices of apple pie that were generous and unself-conscious. They sat at the kitchen table, which was a solid pine table that had clearly been in the family for some years, and they ate and talked, and the evening light moved slowly across the floor, and neither of them seemed in any hurry. She asked him where he was from. He said southeastern Missouri, originally, a farm near Cape Girardeau. He said his family had land there still, but that he had 3 brothers, and the land was sufficient for 2 of them and not really sufficient for 4. And rather than argue about thirds and quarters, he had learned to survey so he could be useful somewhere else. "Did you want the land?" she asked. Not unkindly, just directly. He thought about it honestly. I wanted something of my own, he said. The land in Missouri was never going to be mine in the way I needed, so I found work that took me places where land was being made into something. I like the beginning of things, when the claim is new and the corners have not been set yet. Ruth was watching him. You are good at what you do, she said. I could see that on Thursday. You move through land like it makes sense to you. It usually does, he said. Land is honest. It is what it is. A creek does not run where it does not run. A ridge is where the ridge is. People argue about the record, but the land does not lie. No, she said softly, it does not. Something quiet and warm settled between them at that moment, the way the evening settles when the wind drops and the air becomes still, and both of them were aware of it and neither of them was quite ready to name it yet. But it was there, unmistakably there, like a creek marker on an eastern bank. He stayed until the stars were out, and then rode back to town under a clear sky that smelled like the rain had gone north without hitting Caldwell. And he was thinking, with a clarity that was a little unsettling in its pleasantness, that he had not felt this way about an evening in longer than he could easily recall. The next 3 weeks were the North Claim survey, which kept him busy from early morning until the light was gone most days. He rode out to Ruth's property twice during that time, once on a Saturday when she had asked him to look at a fence line on the western boundary that she was not certain was in the right place, and once without any particular reason except that it was Sunday afternoon, and he had been thinking about it all week. The second visit was the more significant one. She was sitting on the porch steps when he arrived, reading. This surprised him slightly, not because reading was unusual, but because she was sitting in the late Sunday afternoon light with a book in her lap in a way that looked deeply content, and when she looked up and saw him, she did not seem startled or self-conscious. She just looked at him with that direct hazel look and said, "I wondered if you would come by today." He sat down on the steps beside her. Not at the other end of the steps, but beside her, in the reasonable way of two people who had established that they liked each other's company. She offered him tea, which she went inside to make. She came back with 2 tin cups and sat back down, and neither of them commented on the fact that he had arrived with no professional pretense. "What are you reading?" he asked. She showed him. It was a geology survey from the Kansas State Board of Agriculture, which was not what he had expected, but was immediately comprehensible when he thought about it for half a second. "I want to understand the soil composition on the south field better," she said. "There is a clay layer that I think is affecting drainage. If I understand where it is, I might be able to work around it instead of fighting it every spring." "That is a good way to think about it," he said. "Do you know much about soil composition?" "Some," he said. "Enough to be useful, maybe not enough to be expert." "Tell me what you know," she said. So he did. And she listened and asked questions and corrected him once when she had read something that contradicted what he said, and he looked at her page and found she was right, and said so, and she seemed pleased not in a triumphant way but in the genuine way of someone who likes being right because it means the information is good. They sat on the porch steps in the Sunday light for 2 hours and talked about soil and drainage and winter wheat and the creek line, and whether the eastern field would benefit from a windbreak. And by the time the light was turning gold and long and he said he should be heading back, he was aware that something had shifted. He did not ride back to Caldwell immediately. He walked Cooper for a while along the creek road and tried to be honest with himself, because honesty was one of his habits too. What he was aware of was that he looked forward to seeing Ruth Wells with an anticipation that had nothing to do with survey work. That when she talked he listened in a way he did not listen to most people, which was to say completely. That when she laughed, which she did not do constantly, but did with great sincerity when something genuinely struck her as funny, something happened to his chest that he was too old and too sensible to pretend was indigestion. He was 31 years old and had not been in love before, not properly. He had been fond of people. He had been close to people. But this was different in the specific way that different is when you know it is real and not performance. He rode back to town and thought about it. The North Claim survey ended. He filed his measurements, settled the boundary dispute, and had the satisfaction of watching the two neighbors shake hands on the street outside the land office 2 days later. He had new work waiting, 3 more homestead claims and a road survey for the county, and Caldwell was beginning to feel less like a temporary stop and more like a place. He asked Ruth if she would have supper with him in town at the boarding house dining room, which was as close as Caldwell came to a restaurant, and which served an acceptable beef stew and an excellent bread. He asked her on a Wednesday morning when he met her coming out of the dry goods store. She said yes with a directness that he was learning to love, which was that she simply said yes and named a time. And when Saturday evening came, she arrived at the boarding house dining room in a dark blue dress that was neither trying too hard nor not trying at all, with her hair done in a way that was different from the working-day looseness he was used to, and that made her look, he thought, like a painting that had been allowed to be real. He stood when she came in. She sat down across from him and looked at the room with mild curiosity and then looked at him. "You look nervous," she said. "I am a little nervous," he admitted. She looked at him with something that was almost a smile. "Why? Because I care about how this evening goes," he said, which was honest and perhaps more direct than the convention of 1882 generally called for in a first formal supper. But he had observed that Ruth Wells responded well to directness, and he was not built for coyness. She was quiet for a moment. "I do too," she said. They had supper. The beef stew was good. The bread was as excellent as he had promised. They talked about a dozen different things, about the land and the town, and about Missouri, and about her family's history in Kansas. Her parents, who had come west in the early 1870s, when the homesteads were being settled, and her father, who had built the house himself with a neighbor's help, and her mother, who had died when Ruth was 12, and left her with a father who was warm but increasingly frail, and the strong, self-sufficient quality of someone who has understood from an early age that the world will not always arrange itself around your needs. "Did you mind it?" he asked. "The responsibility, being on your own so much?" "I minded being lonely," she said honestly. "I did not mind the work or the decisions. I minded that there was no one to talk to about them. You can make a decision well and still want someone to say, yes, that was the right thing, or no, think about that differently." He looked at her across the table in the warm light of the boarding house dining room. "You have that," he said quietly. "Now, I mean, if you want it." She looked at him steadily. "I think I might," she said. It was not a declaration. It was something better, which was the kind of honest, careful thing you say when you mean it specifically and not in general, and they both knew that, and the evening finished in the warm light of that understanding. He walked her to the edge of town where she had tied her horse. The night was warm, the first real warmth of that Kansas spring, and the stars were out in the particular excess that stars use in the open country, more than seemed strictly necessary. He said good night. She said good night. They were standing close, the way you stand when neither of you is moving away yet, and he looked at her in the starlight and she looked back at him. "Elias," she said. "Yes." "You are the most sensible man I have met in Caldwell." "That might not be the highest possible standard," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that did something to his chest. "It might not be," she said. "But I mean it as a considerable compliment," he smiled. "I know you do." She untied her horse, swung up with the easy grace of someone who has been riding since before she could read, and looked down at him. "Thursday," she said. "I want to start on the windbreak planning if you have time." "I have time," he said. She rode away into the dark, and he stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, before walking back toward the boarding house with the stars overhead, and something warm and certain sitting in his chest like a good fire. The weeks that followed had the quality of something building toward itself, like clouds that are still individual and scattered, but are clearly becoming a storm, except the storm in this case was entirely pleasant. He rode out to her property on Thursdays and Saturdays, which became Wednesdays and Saturdays, which eventually became most days when his survey work did not take him far. She came into town more often too, and not always on errands, and twice they met by something that was technically coincidence and practically not, which both of them acknowledged with the kind of smile that is its own conversation. The windbreak planning became a genuine project. They mapped the prevailing wind patterns from the southwest, marked the positions of the existing trees, identified the gaps that were letting cold air funnel through to the winter wheat. Elias surveyed the lines and Ruth planned the plantings, mostly cottonwood and Osage orange, which were the reliable windbreak species in that part of Kansas, and they spent a full Saturday in late May planting the first run of seedlings along the northwest corner of the south field. There was something about planting things together. It was different from discussing land or measuring boundaries, or sitting on porch steps talking. It was physical work alongside each other, and it had a domesticity that was not awkward but was instead surprisingly comfortable. He dug the holes. She set the seedlings in with a careful, deliberate attention to each one, checking the root depth and the soil contact. They talked while they worked, and also did not talk sometimes, which was one of the better signs. The silences were easy. At one point she was down on one knee beside a newly planted cottonwood seedling, pressing the soil around it firmly, and she looked up at him, and there was a streak of mud on her jaw and her hair was coming down, and she was squinting a little against the afternoon sun, and Elias Hunter thought that he loved her with a completeness that was both surprising and entirely unsurprising. He did not say it that afternoon. It was not quite the moment. But he knew it, with the same certainty with which he knew where the creek marker was and where the ridge ran, the quiet, factual certainty of something that was simply true and had no need to argue about itself. He started looking for property. He was not impulsive about it. He was not the kind of man who was impulsive about anything, except possibly about walking Cooper down creek roads on Sunday afternoons without particular destination. He spent 2 weeks looking at available claims and pieces of land around Caldwell with the professional eye of someone who knew what he was looking for, and he found what he wanted in the first week of June, 120 acres northwest of town, adjoining the county road, with good soil and a spring-fed pond and 2 established cottonwood trees that had been there long enough to mean the water table was reliable. He bought it. He did not tell Ruth immediately. He thought about how to tell her, which was unusual for him, because usually he just said what he was thinking. But this required more careful thought because it was a statement that was really 2 things at once. It was saying he was staying in Caldwell, and it was saying why. He told her on a June evening when the air was soft and warm and they were sitting on her porch steps where a great many of their conversations had begun and continued and sometimes ended, and the fireflies were just starting in the grass along the creek. "I bought land," he said. Ruth looked at him. "Here, in Caldwell, northwest of town, 120 acres with a spring pond." She was quiet. Fireflies rose and fell in the grass. He could hear the creak and the last birds settling. "That is not survey work land," she said carefully. "Survey work land is wherever the next survey is." "No," he said, "it is not." She looked at him for a moment with something that was not quite the measuring look she used most of the time. It was a different kind of looking, more careful and also more open. "Why?" she said. "Because Caldwell has become a place where I want to stay," he said. "Because of you, Ruth. Because I have been thinking about little else for 3 months and I thought you should know that." The fireflies rose and fell. The creek ran. Ruth Wells looked at the man sitting beside her on the steps, and her expression was doing something complex and quiet that he could not entirely read. She was not a woman who cried easily, he had come to know that, but there was something around her eyes that looked like it might become something if she let it. "I am not easy to be with," she said. "People will tell you that. Men in this town have told you that already." "I know," he said. "I am not looking for easy. I am looking for honest." "I might argue with you," she said, "about things." "I hope you will," he said. "I am generally right more often when someone is willing to tell me when I am wrong." Ruth looked at him for another moment, and then she did something he had not seen her do before. She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee, just set her hand on his, warm and direct and simple, and left it there. "I have been thinking about little else either," she said, in case that was not entirely clear. It had not been entirely clear because Ruth Wells did not make things obvious until she chose to, but the clarity once given was absolute and warm, and it settled into his chest beside the fire that had been burning there for 3 months. He turned his hand over and held hers. The fireflies rose and fell in the warm Kansas dark. Summer in Kansas in 1882 was its own kind of education. It was hot in a way that was specific and serious, a heat that built through the day and pressed down on the grass and the fields and the roof of every house in Caldwell. But there was always the evening, and the evenings were what made Kansas worth it, when the heat relented, and the light went gold and long, and the wind came back from the southwest, bringing the smell of the plains. Elias and Ruth moved through the summer together in the particular way of two people who have established something real and are building on top of it daily. He worked his new property when his survey contracts allowed, clearing the land he wanted to break for a kitchen garden first, then the field he intended for corn, driving fence posts along the boundaries with the satisfaction of someone building something that would last. She came out on Saturdays and sometimes midweek and helped plan the layout of the house he was going to build, because the small structure on the property currently was barely a claim shack and would need to be replaced if it was going to be anything permanent. They talked about the house the way they talked about windbreaks and soil composition, practically and seriously, and with genuine enjoyment of the planning itself. She had ideas about the kitchen which were specific and architectural, and showed that she had been thinking about kitchen design the way she thought about everything, which was to say carefully. He had ideas about the rooms and the window placement, the way to catch the morning light from the east and avoid the worst of the western afternoon heat. "You have been thinking about this for a while," she said one afternoon, looking at the rough sketches he had made. "For a while," he agreed. "Before you bought the land." He looked at her. "A little before," he admitted. She looked down at the sketches again, and she was smiling with the particular quality of a smile that is trying not to be as wide as it wants to be. Caldwell in 1882 was a cattle town at the end of the Kishom Trail, which meant it had a particular character. The cattle drives came through in the summer, which brought cowboys and trail hands and money and noise, and the attendant complications of a town that was required to absorb a great deal of rough energy in a short time. Elias was not unfamiliar with trail town dynamics. He had worked his way through several of them in his years of survey work. Ruth had a complicated relationship with the trail season. It was good for the economy of Caldwell, which meant the stores she depended on stayed solvent, and the county services stayed funded. But it also meant a particular kind of atmosphere in the main street and the saloons, a rougher, louder energy that she navigated with the practical alertness of someone who knew when to be in town and when not to be. She was in town on a Wednesday in mid-July to pick up supplies from the dry goods store, and Elias happened to be filing survey paperwork at the land office, and they were walking back toward the end of the main street together, when a group of trail hands came out of the dusty spur with the cheerful belligerence of men who had been drinking since early afternoon. One of them, a big man with a sunburned neck and the look of someone who believed himself entertaining, made a loud and specifically unpleasant comment about Ruth as they passed. Not a threatening comment, but the kind of casually dismissive, ownership-assuming comment that 1882 made easy for men to make about women in public, and it was the kind of comment that was meant to be heard. It was heard. Ruth stopped walking. She turned. The look on her face was not angry in the hot, reactive way. It was the measured, clear-eyed look of someone who has decided to address a thing directly. "I did not hear you say that to me," she said, in a voice that carried with perfect clarity. "So you will have an opportunity to say something else." The trail hand blinked. He had not expected to be addressed. Women on main streets in 1882 were not supposed to turn around and respond. "I am talking to my friend," he started. "You were looking at me when you said it," Ruth said. "I am giving you a chance to say something else." Elias was standing beside her. He was not in front of her. He was not between her and the man. He was standing beside her in the way of someone who is present and steady and waiting to see if anything further is needed, which nothing turned out to be, because the man, faced with Ruth Wells looking at him with calm, clear expectation, found that he had something else to say after all, which was nothing, which was exactly right. Ruth turned back and they walked on. Elias waited a moment before speaking. "You did not need me to say anything," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I noticed you did not step in front of me. It was your conversation to have." She looked at him sideways as they walked. "Most men would have stepped in front of me. Most men would have thought they were being helpful," he said. "I thought you were handling it." She was quiet for a little while as they walked. "Elias," she said. "Yes. I think I love you." He stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at him in the bright July light of the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, with people and horses and the noise of the trail season all around them and none of it mattering at all. "I know I love you," he said. The corners of her mouth moved. "That is more confident than my version. I have had more practice with the certainty," he said. "You arrived at it faster than I expected." She laughed, a real and unguarded laugh, right there on the main street of Caldwell in the middle of the summer cattle season, and he thought it was the best sound he had heard in his entire adult life. They were married in September. The wedding was at the small Methodist church on the north end of Caldwell, on a Saturday morning when the weather had finally relented from the summer heat, and there was a cool, clean quality to the air that felt like a beginning. Ruth wore a cream-colored dress that she had made herself over the preceding 2 months, practical enough to work in, but with a careful attention to the collar and cuffs that showed the seriousness with which she had approached the making of it. Elias wore his best suit, which was dark wool and fit him well, and he stood at the front of the church with the same calm, steady quality he brought to everything, except that when Ruth walked in through the back door, and the small congregation turned to look at her, something in his face changed in a way that was visible from 20 feet away. The minister, a dry and efficient man named Reverend Colby, who had performed enough frontier marriages to know which ones would last, noted privately that this one had the particular quality of something that had been built rather than rushed. He performed the ceremony with his usual brisk sincerity and did not editorialize, which was his best quality. Ruth said her vows with a directness that made 3 women in the congregation press handkerchiefs to their eyes, not because she was weeping, but because she was so clearly not performing. She meant every word with the full weight of her intelligence and her will, which was considerable, and the room felt it. Elias said his vows to her and only her, looking at her face the whole time with the attentive, present quality that had always characterized him. And when he said that he would be her partner in all things and her companion in the building of a life that was honestly theirs, Ruth Wells looked back at him with warm hazel eyes and something that was more than a smile. The reception was at the boarding house, because the boarding house dining room was the largest indoor space in Caldwell available for the purpose, and the proprietress, a formidable woman named Mrs. Harker, who had a talent for organization and a soft spot for Elias because he always thanked her for meals, had outdone herself with the food. There was roasted chicken and good bread and apple cake, which was a deliberate choice because Ruth had brought Mrs. Harker one of her apple pies back in the spring, and Mrs. Harker had never forgotten it. Harlan Boggs came to the reception because Caldwell was small and he came to everything. He shook Elias' hand with the slightly puzzled air of a man who had given a warning and watched it be cheerfully ignored. "She is quite a woman," Harlan said, looking across the room to where Ruth was talking with Mrs. Harker and 2 other women with the animated ease of someone who was enjoying herself. "She is," Elias agreed. "You were not worried," Harlan said, "about, the temperament." Elias looked at him. "The temperament you are describing," he said patiently, "is good judgment and self-respect. No, I was not worried about it." Harlan looked at him again with the foreign language expression and then moved away toward the apple cake. Elias went across the room to his wife. She looked up when he came to her side and made a small, instinctive room for him in the way of people who are already comfortable in each other's space. "Harlan just told me not to worry about your temperament," he said quietly. Ruth glanced toward Harlan with the mild, unimpressed look she reserved for him specifically. "What did you say?" "I said your temperament was good judgment and self-respect." She turned and looked at him, and the smile she gave him was different from all the others. It was specific and warm and private. "That is the best wedding present anyone has given me today," she said. He moved into the Wells house in October because it was the more established property, and because his own claim would take until the following spring to have the new house built on it. They had agreed that the Wells house would be their home, and his land would be incorporated into their working property, which doubled the acreage and made the farming operation considerably more viable. The first morning that Elias Hunter woke up in what was now fully his home, with the October light coming through the east window just as he had always wanted it to come through a window, and Ruth asleep beside him with her dark hair loose on the pillow and her breathing quiet and steady, he lay there for a while and thought about what he had built. Not built in the sense of fences and houses and windbreaks, though he had built those too. Built in the sense of a life that belonged to him and to her together, that had been made through a series of honest choices and real conversations and work done side by side, and that no one had governed either of them into. He got up quietly and made coffee, and when Ruth came downstairs 20 minutes later, her hair pinned back and her face clear and awake, she poured herself a cup and sat down across from him at the old pine table and said, "Good morning," with the simple warmth of someone who means it. "Good morning," he said. Outside the kitchen window, the October Kansas morning was gold and cool, and the cottonwoods along the creek were turning, their leaves going the pale, brilliant yellow of Kansas autumn, and the windbreak seedlings they had planted together in the spring were already 8 inches tall. Winter came in November and was serious about it, because winter in southern Kansas in 1882 was a serious business. There were days when the temperature dropped low enough to be genuinely dangerous, and the wind came howling down from the north without the slightest apology. They were prepared for it. Ruth had been running this property through 3 Kansas winters already and knew what preparation looked like. Together they had put up enough hay to last the horses and the 2 milk cows through to March even in a hard year, and the root cellar was well stocked, and the firewood was stacked higher than Elias thought was strictly necessary, until the first serious norther came in, and he revised his opinion. They were good together in the winter in the specific way of people who find that being indoors together is not a confinement. The evenings were long and they read, and talked and played cards, and argued amicably about things that were worth arguing about, and agreed on things that were worth agreeing on. Ruth had a better chess mind than Elias and beat him 3 times out of 4, which he accepted with genuine good humor, because he was actually more interested in watching how she played than in winning himself. She was not easy to know, not in the sense of being transparent or uncomplicated. She had depths and complicated places and opinions that sometimes surprised him even after months of knowing her. But she was honest, entirely honest, in the way of someone who had learned that honesty was more durable than performance, and that made her knowable in the way that mattered most. They argued twice that winter, genuinely argued, not the mild disagreements of 2 people being careful with each other. Once about the plan for breaking the new north field in the spring, where she thought his timeline was too aggressive, and he thought her caution was excessive, and they both turned out to be partially right when they compared notes with a neighboring farmer who had tried both approaches. The argument resolved productively, which Elias thought was the best kind. The second argument was sharper and involved something he had done without consulting her, a decision about a new survey contract that would have taken him away for 3 weeks, which he had accepted before telling her. She was not angry in the reactive way. She was quietly, specifically angry in the way of someone who had expected better and was naming exactly why. "This is our life now," she said. "The decisions that affect it are ours together. I do not need to agree with every decision you make, but I need you to make them with me." That was what we said. He heard her. He did not defend himself. He said she was right and he was sorry, and he went back to the survey contractor the next day and negotiated the contract down to 12 days instead of 3 weeks and came home and told her what he had done. She looked at him for a moment. "You did not need to shorten it," she said. "I would have understood 3 weeks." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to be home." The rest of the winter was warm in all the ways that matter. Spring arrived in March with the insistence that Kansas springs have, and with it came the real beginning of what Elias and Ruth were building together. The north field was broken in stages, as they had agreed, and the planting went in with the accumulated intelligence of her 3 years of experience and his capacity for good planning working together. The windbreak seedlings from the previous spring were showing strong second-year growth. The new survey work kept him busy, but locally, the county contracts that came from being the established surveyor in the area rather than the traveling kind. And in April, Ruth told him she was going to have a baby. She told him on a morning when the spring was in full aggressive motion, and the kitchen garden was already showing green rows of early vegetables, and the birds were making an absolute production of the cottonwood trees along the creek. She told him plainly, in the direct way she had for all significant things, sitting across from him at the pine table with her coffee cup in her hands. He was quiet for a moment, which was not the same as being non-responsive. He was absorbing it with the full, present attention that she recognized. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Good," she said. "A little tired in the evenings, mostly good." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He did not say anything immediately. She did not need him to say anything immediately. That was one of the things she had come to love most about him. "I am very glad," he said eventually, quietly. "Are you?" "Very," she said. He turned her hand over and held it the way he had held it that first evening with the fireflies, and they sat with the spring morning coming in through the east window and the birds making their extravagant noise in the cottonwoods. The summer of 1883 was the summer of the baby coming and the house being finished. The house on Elias' original claim land was completed in July, which was not the original house at all but the new one that they had planned together, with the east-facing windows and the good kitchen and the extra room they were going to need by autumn. They had decided to keep the Wells house as working property and move into the new one, which felt right to both of them, a new house for what was newly theirs together. Ruth was practical about the pregnancy in the way she was practical about everything. She modified what she needed to modify and did not modify what she did not need to modify, which meant she was in the kitchen garden until August and doing paperwork for the farm accounts right through to September. Elias was attentive in a way that was not smothering, which was the right balance, and which she told him directly she appreciated. "Most women at this stage are treated like they have become a different category of person," she said. "You have not become a different category of person," he said. "You are going to have a baby. Those are different things." She looked at him. "You keep saying exactly the right thing." "I keep meaning exactly the right thing," he said. The baby came in November. It was a boy, born on a Tuesday afternoon when the first cold snap of autumn had arrived, and the air outside the bedroom window was sharp and clean. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Dolan who had brought half of Caldwell's children into the world, declared him strong and loud, which were indeed his primary characteristics at that moment. Elias was there. He had not been expected to be there, because in 1882 and 1883 men were generally not expected to be present at births, but he had asked, and Ruth had said yes, and he had stayed. He was not in the way. He was useful in the specific practical ways that the situation required. And when the boy arrived and was placed in Ruth's arms, and she looked down at him with a combination of exhaustion and wonder that was the most beautiful thing Elias had ever seen in his life, he was there to see it. They named him Thomas James Hunter, Thomas for Ruth's father, James for Elias, which seemed right in the way of things that honor where you came from while making something new. Thomas was a person from the start. He had Ruth's dark hair and Elias' dark eyes, and an opinion about everything that manifested first as noise and later, much later, as words. But the opinion was clearly present from the beginning. He nursed well and slept decently, and looked at the world with wide, interested eyes that seemed to be assessing it for quality and interest. Elias held him on the second morning of his life while Ruth slept, which she badly needed to do, and stood at the east window with his son against his shoulder, looking out at the Kansas morning. The windbreak cottonwoods were bare now, their November branches dark against the pale sky. The south field was turned and resting for winter. The spring pond was still and bright. 120 acres plus 280, 400 acres of land that was honestly theirs. Thomas made a sound that was small and exploratory, as if testing the acoustics of the morning. "That is our land," Elias said to him quietly. "We will show you all of it when the weather is better." Thomas appeared to find this acceptable. The town of Caldwell received the news of the baby with the particular interest that small towns bring to new additions. Mrs. Harker sent food, which was generous. Harlan Boggs sent a note of congratulation that managed to be cordial if brief. Several of the women who had become genuinely friendly with Ruth over the past year came by with practical gifts and genuine warmth. One visitor that winter was notable enough to require telling. A man named Clayton Webb rode out to the Hunter property in January, which was cold but not dangerously so, and he came with an air of purpose that Elias recognized from the road as something he would need to pay attention to. Clayton Webb had bought the Clement land from Grover Tilden the previous autumn. He was a different kind of man from Tilden, who had been evasive and political in his approach to the boundary dispute. Webb was direct, but directness can take several forms, and his version of it had the quality of a man who was used to directing things in his own direction. He came about the creek boundary. Specifically, he came about a drainage channel that he wanted to cut from the Clement land through the edge of Ruth and Elias' property to redirect runoff from his northern fields. He presented this as a proposal. He was polite about it. But he had a map with him that showed the drainage channel already designed, and the design crossed the corrected boundary line, and he presented it with the air of someone who believed the politeness was primarily a formality before the agreement. Elias looked at the map. Ruth looked at the map. They looked at each other briefly with the specific economy of communication that married people who know each other well develop. "No," Ruth said. Webb looked at her, and then at Elias with the slight recalibration of someone who had expected a different conversational structure. "This would benefit both properties," Webb said. "The drainage improvement would reduce spring flooding along the entire creek section." "It would reduce flooding on your north fields," Ruth said, with the calm precision of someone who had read the map carefully. "The channel as drawn does not benefit our property. It crosses our lower east corner, which is already well drained, and gives access to your fields without compensation or corresponding benefit." Webb was quiet for a moment. "I could offer something for the easement." "What are you offering?" Elias said. Webb named a figure. Elias and Ruth looked at each other again. The figure was low enough to be insulting if you knew what the land access was worth. "Double that," Elias said. "And the channel has to be built on a specific line that we will survey together so the drainage is managed correctly. If the channel is built wrong, it will undercut our eastern fence line within 3 years." Webb looked at him with the reassessment of someone encountering competence he had not budgeted for. They negotiated for an hour. They came to an agreement that was fair to both properties and clearly written, with survey markers and maintenance responsibilities specified. Webb left with the slightly different air of a man who had arrived expecting to direct the terms, and departed with the acknowledgement that the terms had been shared. When he was gone, Ruth went to the kitchen and made coffee and brought 2 cups to the front room where Elias was looking over the final agreement to make sure everything was as they had discussed. "You were right about the fence line," she said, handing him a cup. "I had not seen that risk until you said it." "You were right about the drainage benefit," he said. "I was about to accept the low number before you held the line." "We were both right about different things," she said. "We generally are," he said. She sat down beside him on the settee with Thomas asleep in the cradle 3 feet away, and he put his arm around her and they sat in the January afternoon and looked at the agreement and the fire in the hearth and were quietly, thoroughly satisfied with the life they had made. The years settled into themselves with the rhythm of a good life, which is to say they were not uneventful, but they were built on something solid enough to absorb the events. The spring of 1884 brought a hailstorm in May that damaged the corn crop badly enough to require a replanting of the southern section, which they did together in 3 long days of physical work that left them both tired and sunburned but satisfied. The replanting came in late and thin that season, but the north field compensated well, and the winter wheat had been excellent, so the year closed financially sound if not flush. Ruth began, that same year, to involve herself in the questions that the other homesteading women in the area were asking about property rights and water rights, and the various legal and economic pressures that were being brought to bear on small farm operations by the larger cattle interests moving into southern Kansas. She was careful and precise about it, as she was about everything, and she had the advantage of knowing exactly what the law said because she had always made it her business to know. She started meeting with a small group of women, 3 or 4 at first, to discuss these questions and to share information about what their property documents said and what their legal rights were in practice. This was not an official organization of any kind. It was a group of women sitting in someone's kitchen talking about things that mattered to their families' futures. But it had a practical effectiveness that surprised even Ruth, because information shared is information multiplied, and several of the women in that group successfully pushed back on property interpretations that had been quietly working against them once they knew what the law actually said. Elias was entirely supportive of this. He was occasionally asked to explain survey documents or legal descriptions, which he did without condescension and without taking the conversation over. When Ruth came home from those meetings with her mind full and her arguments sharp, he listened to the whole of it and engaged honestly with the parts he had thoughts about, and said so when he did not know enough to have a useful thought. "You are a useful person to be married to," she told him one evening after a particularly productive meeting in which a question about riparian rights had come up that she had needed to think through carefully. "High praise," he said. "It is the highest kind," she said sincerely. "Useful and trustworthy and honest. That is the whole of it." In the spring of 1885, Thomas, who was a year and a half old and operating at a noise level that seemed disproportionate to his size, became a brother. Ruth's second pregnancy had been similar to the first, practically managed and without serious complication. The second baby arrived in April, another boy, whom they named Samuel after no one in particular, except that they had agreed they both liked the name. Samuel was quieter than Thomas in every observable way, a small, observant presence who watched the world from the beginning with the specific patience of someone taking notes. He had Ruth's hazel eyes and Elias' calm quality, and the combination was disarming in a baby. Thomas received his brother with the philosophical acceptance of a child who has been told this is happening and has decided to reserve judgment. Within 3 months, the judgment had come in positive. Thomas identified Samuel as a satisfactory audience for the experiments he was conducting with blocks and dirt and the various mobile objects in his environment, and Samuel appeared to find this entirely agreeable. The Hunter property in 1885 was a working and functioning farm, with 400 acres under various stages of cultivation and management, a well-maintained house, a good barn with a sound roof, 2 horses, 4 cows, a kitchen garden that was Ruth's particular pride and ongoing project, and a windbreak along the northwest corner of the south field that had grown into an actual windbreak. The cottonwoods now 15 feet tall, and doing their job with quiet effectiveness. The corrected boundary line on the eastern creek ran exactly where Elias had surveyed it in 1882. The rock outcropping on the eastern bank was right where it had always been, unchanged and unconcerned. The survey practice was steady. Elias had built a regional reputation as someone whose measurements were reliable and whose records were clean, which meant he had more work than he could sometimes take, and the ability to choose his clients. He kept it local enough that he rarely needed to be away from home more than 2 or 3 days at a time, and when he was away, Ruth ran the property with the complete competence she had always run it with. She did not run it differently when he was there than when he was not. She did not ask his permission to make decisions, and he did not expect her to. This was simply how their household worked, 2 people with their own minds and their own expertise operating in genuine partnership. When they disagreed, they said so. When one of them was wrong, they said that too. The household was, as a result, very efficient and very honest and warmer than it might appear from the outside, because warmth of the lasting kind is often built on the same foundations as efficiency. One evening in the autumn of 1885, with Thomas asleep and Samuel asleep, and the house quiet around them, they were sitting in front of the fire in the way they often sat in the evenings, Ruth with her account books and Elias with the geological survey he had been working his way through because Ruth had gotten him interested in soil composition, and he had never looked back. The fire was low and steady. Outside, the Kansas autumn was cold and still. Ruth closed her account book and looked at the fire for a while. "I want to tell you something," she said. Elias looked up. "Tell me." "When I was 25, she said, "I had decided I would not get married. Not because I did not want to love someone, but because everything I had seen about marriage was about one person managing another person, and I was not willing to be managed." He was listening the way he listened completely. "I am 30 years old now," she said, "and I have been married to you for 3 years, and I want to tell you that you have never managed me. Not once. Not in any way, small or large. You have disagreed with me, and you have been right and been wrong, and you have worked alongside me and argued with me and been entirely present in this life we have. But you have never tried to make me smaller or quieter or more convenient." She was looking at the fire. He was looking at her. "I want you to know that I know what that is," she said, "how rare it is, and that I am grateful for it every day, and that I love you in a way that I did not know was possible 3 years ago." Elias set his geological survey down on the arm of his chair. He looked at his wife in the firelight, her dark hair and her serious, honest face, and the warmth in her expression that was only for him and that he had been the lucky recipient of for 3 years, and intended to go on being for the rest of his life. "Ruth," he said. "Yes. I had a very low probability of finding you," he said. "I had been working my way across the plains for 8 years, and I had not found what I was looking for. I did not even know exactly what I was looking for. And then Harlan Boggs told me you were ungovernable, and I thought, that sounds like a woman worth meeting." She looked at him now, and the smile that came to her face was the wide, unguarded one. "He warned you," she said. "He tried to," Elias agreed. "I was not in the market for the kind of warning he was selling." "No," she said. "You were not." She uncurled from her chair and came to sit beside him in his, which was possible if they arranged themselves companionably, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they sat with the fire burning low and the house quiet around them and the Kansas night cold and clear outside. "3 years," she said. "3 years," he agreed. "And Samuel asleep in there." He nodded toward the hallway. "And Thomas, who is going to be an engineer or a natural disaster, possibly both." and 400 acres with cottonwoods that are actually working now. And you, she said, right here every day. Every day, he said, that is the plan. She settled more comfortably against him. He held her with the quiet ease of someone for whom this was home in the deepest sense. Outside, an owl was calling somewhere along the creek, and the fire shifted and settled, and outside the east window the stars were doing their unreasonable Kansas best, bright and numerous and entirely indifferent to anything except being stars, which they were very good at. The winter of 1885 into 1886 was one of the hardest Kansas had seen in years. The cold came early and stayed late, and the northern winds were vicious enough to make the windbreak more than decorative. Elias had prepared well, because he had learned from Ruth how to read the signs, and he had the advantage of a well-surveyed property that he understood down to its drainage patterns and wind channels. The livestock came through in good condition. The winter wheat survived under a protective layer of snow and came up strong in March. There was a week in January when the temperature dropped low enough to keep them mostly indoors for 4 consecutive days, which with Thomas at 2.5 and Samuel at 9 months was a particular domestic adventure. Ruth managed this with the same practical competence she brought to everything, organizing activities and maintaining routine, and somehow managing to keep 2 small children engaged in ways that were relatively quiet, which was not Thomas's natural mode. On the third of those confined days, in the afternoon when Samuel was asleep, and Thomas was engaged in a private investigation of the kitchen pots and pans that required all of his concentration, Elias found Ruth standing at the east window looking out at the frozen landscape, with an expression he had come to recognize as the one that meant she was thinking about something important. He stood beside her and looked out at what she was looking at, which was the snow-covered south field and the dark shapes of the windbreak cottonwoods against the white sky. They stood there together in the quiet of a cold afternoon. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Roots," she said. "The cottonwood roots under that snow. They have been growing for 3 years in frozen ground and warm ground in dry summers and wet springs, and they are still there. They will be there in the spring." "They will," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I think we are like that," she said. He looked at her. "Rooted," she said. "In each other, whatever comes, we are rooted." He took her hand where it rested on the window frame. Cold light came in through the glass and fell on them both. "Yes," he said simply, "we are." Spring came again in 1886 with the certainty that Kansas springs have, which is aggressive and unconditional and not particularly interested in whether you are ready. The south field came back green. The winter wheat proved excellent. The cottonwoods put out their new leaves, pale and bright, the same color they had been that first morning along the creek when Elias had driven the marker stakes and Ruth had talked about her own mind. Thomas was 3 now and conducting himself like a small investigative reporter of the natural world, bringing Elias specimens of interesting rocks and demanding explanations for everything from cloud formation to the behavior of the creek when it rained. Elias answered every question with the same serious attention he gave to everything, which Thomas appeared to consider the appropriate response. Samuel walked at 11 months, and then spent the next several months practicing with the focused determination of someone training for something. On a Saturday morning in May, when the planting was underway, and the kitchen garden was already showing the first lettuces, and the windbreak was in full leaf, and the south field had the good, dense green of a healthy crop coming in, Ruth came out of the house and walked to the south field where Elias was working. She was wearing her working clothes and her hair was back, and she was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which she handed him one of and kept one for herself. They stood at the field edge and looked at what they had made. "I want to add a beehive," she said. He considered this. "Where were you thinking?" "On the south side of the barn, out of the main wind path. The clover in the lower pasture would give them good forage." He looked toward the barn and assessed the south side. "That would work," he said. You will want a windbreak directly behind it. There is a good 3 feet of south wall that is sheltered." "I measured it," she said. Of course she had. He smiled. "I found a man in Wellington who keeps bees," she said. "He said he would sell a starter colony in June. I want to have the hive ready." "I will build the stand next week," he said. She looked at him sideways, just like that. "You have done the research," he said. "The location makes sense. Why would I argue with it?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the field. Then she said, "When I was 25 and I decided I would not get married, I did not imagine that being married could mean this." "What does this mean to you?" he asked. "Someone who says just like that," she said. "Someone who trusts my judgment because they know it is good, not because they are being permissive. Someone who builds the stand." She looked up at him in the May morning light with the field green behind her and the cottonwoods bright in the wind. "You, specifically. This life, specifically." He looked at her the way he had looked at her on the porch steps with the fireflies, the way he had looked at her outside the land office and in the boarding house dining room and at the church and at the east window in the winter. The way he always looked at her, which was with complete and present attention that had never once diminished. "I will build the stand," he said. She laughed and he laughed, and Thomas, who had appeared from somewhere behind them with a frog in each hand, looked at his parents laughing in the May morning and decided this was acceptable behavior and joined in, for no clear reason except that their laughter was contagious and the morning was good. The bees came in June and were established without incident. They proved excellent, as Ruth had known they would, and by August were producing honey at a rate that delighted the household and allowed for a considerable surplus that Ruth sold in town with quiet satisfaction. Summer moved through its long days and came to its end in the amber and gold of a Kansas September, and they moved through it together, Elias and Ruth Hunter and the boys, and the land that was theirs. In September, on the 3rd anniversary of their wedding, Elias came in from the north field at noon and found that Ruth had made lunch with unusual deliberateness, the good plates and a tablecloth that was not for every day, and she had fresh coffee and the kitchen smelled like the apple cake she had made, which she only made for specific occasions. He washed his hands and sat down. She sat across from him with the warm, direct expression that meant she had something to say. "I am expecting again," she said. He looked at her. The September light came through the east window and fell across the old pine table between them, the same table that had been here when he came to this house 3 years ago, that had held deeds and survey documents and account books and coffee cups and children's porridge and every meal of their married life. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Good," she said. "A little tired. Mostly very good." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. 3 years of marriage, and this was still the most natural movement in the world. "A girl," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "You cannot know that." "No," he agreed. "But it feels like a girl." She looked at him with amusement. "You have no basis for that." "I have 35 years of instinct," he said. She shook her head, smiling. "We will see." In late April of 1887, the third Hunter child arrived. She was a girl. Elias had told no one of his prediction except Ruth, who received the confirmation with a combination of exasperated affection and delight. They named her Clara Me. Clara because Ruth had always liked the sound of it. Me because the light in the room when she arrived had the quality of a May morning even though it was April. And Elias had said so, and Ruth had said yes. Clara Me Hunter came into the world with dark hair and hazel eyes, which put her in fine company, and an expression in those first wide-open minutes that appeared thoughtful, which Thomas had met with enthusiasm, and Samuel had met with equanimity, and Clara met with apparent consideration. Thomas, at 3½, was fascinated and territorial in roughly equal measure, and spent the first several days informing everyone who visited that this was his sister. Samuel, at 2, studied her with his characteristic patience, and then, on her 3rd day of life, put his small hand very gently on her head in a gesture so deliberate and tender that Ruth, standing in the doorway watching, had to put her hand over her mouth. Elias was at the window again, as he had been on Thomas's second morning of life. But this time Ruth was awake, sitting up in bed with Clara against her shoulder, and Thomas and Samuel were both asleep in the next room, and the April morning light was coming through the east window exactly as it should. He turned from the window and looked at his family. Ruth looked back at him over their daughter's head, with 4 years of love and honest work and shared difficulty and specific joy in her expression, with the directness that had been hers from the first morning outside the land office and that had never diminished, and with a warmth that was his alone, and that he knew was his alone, and that he would spend the rest of his life being grateful for. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and she shifted Clara so that she was between them, small and new and breathing with the serious, complete dedication of the newly arrived. "Elias," Ruth said. "Yes. They told you I was ungovernable." "Did," he said, "and you were not looking to govern anyone." "I was not," he agreed. She looked at him with the warm, private smile that was entirely hers and that she had been giving him for 4 years. "So we got along perfectly," she said. He looked at her and at Clara between them, and at the east light coming through the window onto the old pine table he could see through the doorway, and at the windbreak cottonwoods he could see through the window, tall and green in the April morning. "Perfectly," he said. Outside, on the Kansas plains that rolled away in every direction toward every horizon, the spring was in full and unconditional motion. The south field was greening. The bees were beginning their season. The creek ran where the creek ran, honest and unchanged, with the rock outcropping on the eastern bank right where the original deed had always said it was. Thomas woke up and called from the next room, and Samuel's footsteps followed shortly after, small and determined on the floorboards. Ruth handed Clara to Elias, who took her with the easy, secure confidence of a man who had been doing this for 3 years, and went to see to the boys. He sat at the edge of the bed with his daughter against his chest, her small weight impossibly light and impossibly consequential, and listened to the sounds of his household waking, Ruth's voice and Thomas's questions that came in rapid succession every morning and Samuel's steadier lower register, and the sound of the kitchen fire being built up and the particular creak of the step at the bottom of the stairs. He looked out the east window at the morning that was coming in bright and clean and unlimited, over his land and Ruth's land that were their land, over the windbreak cottonwoods they had planted together, and the creek that ran where it ran, and the spring pond that had been there when he bought the property and would be there long after, over 400 acres of Kansas that were as honest and as specific as the woman in the next room. Clara opened her eyes and looked at him with the wide, dark, hazel-tinted eyes that were already her mother's. "Good morning," he said to her quietly. She looked at him with the focused, assessing quality of someone taking his measure. He smiled. She was, he thought, going to get along fine. Ruth came back to the doorway and leaned against it, looking at the two of them with an expression that was so complete and so warm that it required no translation. "Breakfast," she said. "Yes," he said. He stood carefully with Clara secure against his shoulder, and walked toward his wife in the April morning light, and behind them the east window framed the day that was opening over their land, over their life, over everything they had built and were still building, clean and bright and entirely their own.